The Norman French played an essential role in the history of England and the English language. The Norman invasion made many short-term as well as many very important long-term effects. The invasion impacted things like England's political system to the English Church. The lasting impact of the Normans helped explain why English is the way it is today, and how the English language was changed by a shift of power. The Norman French were first Viking raiders. In the 8th century, the Normans would raid different settlements along the coast of Europe. In the 9th century, they switched their focus onto the French coastlines. They then proceeded to make bases and castles along the coast for protection and refuge. Because they conquered so much, other nations perceived the Normans as ruthless and barbaric. They were known for the love of war and battle. In battle, they were sly and courageous, and had good tactics that were known to destroy armies much bigger than their size. Even though the Normans successfully took over many places, its most famous victory was at the Battle of Hastings, which they took control of England. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, assembled an army of 4,000 to 7,000 soldiers to fight Harold, who was in control of England in that time. Harold had a very well-trained army, and at first William's troops panicked. But then William rallied up his troops and they killed many of the English soldiers. Once they killed Harold and his army fled, they went to isolate London, which led to England's surrender. After the Normans took over England, there were some revolts, but they were successfully suppressed. There were many things that changed after William and his army defeated the English. England became a lot more connected to France politically because that is where the Normans are from. And the Normans also changed the political system by dividing England to many Norman tenants-in-chief, which resulted in the replacement of English aristocrats with Norman ones. Local governments and one centralized government also merged with the Normans. They established a good working judicial system and enforced Anglo-Saxon law. The church also saw change, with all the English bishops being replaced with Norman ones. All these changes were large, but the change that made the biggest impact was English being replaced with Latin and French as the scholarly and official languages.
The words that English often borrowed from French all involve topics that the aristocrats would have to deal with. This is because speaking French was considered higher up, and the aristocrats were the ones that did. So when the French left, the words that were borrowed had to do with what the aristocrats would have dealt with on a daily routine. Some examples of groups of these words are words to do with law and government, church, nobility, military, cooking, culture, and luxury goods. Words to do with law and government from French are words like judge, state, tax, and prison. Words that have to do with church are words like prayer, sacrament, and abbot. Words that have to do with nobility are baron, baroness, prince, princess, count, countess, and so on for the rest of the categories as well. And most of the words that are borrowed, a commoner would rarely have to deal with. On how many occasions would a commoner have to deal with something like a judge, a prison, a captain, or salmon, all of which some aristocrats would have had to deal with on a daily basis? While there are some words that are just straight up from French with no equivalent in English, some words are doublets. Two different words that have something to do with similar. These are words like cow and beef, calf and veal, and swine and pork. As you can see, the words that are from French are often the results of the first word. A cow would be raised for beef, a calf for veal, and a swine for pork. The reason that the end product of the animal is from French is because that is what the aristocrats would have had to deal with. And because of how the Norman French ruled, the aristocrats ended up speaking French while the commoners spoke English. So the words for the items that the aristocrats would have had to deal with are mostly from French, but the words for what the commoners would have had to deal with to produce, that would have come from English. However, in some cases, two words are close to the same thing, just means something slightly different, and one word sounds higher up, like sweat and perspire. As for most of the words from French, the original French word is often almost the same, and in some cases even spelled the same. As for the words that are spelled differently, many are still pronounced similarly, like juge and judge, abbe and abbot, prayer and prayer. All sound very similar. And the biggest difference between most of these words is the accent. This probably changed the most for English after the Great Vowel Shift.
Despite the fact that the Normans conquered England in 1066, in 1364, English prevailed as the official language of England after almost 300 years of Norman French being the official language. Why? From after the Norman invasion until around 2000, English was mostly the spoken language of the common people and French the language of the elite. Documents were written primarily in French and Latin during this time, and not in English, and as a result, there was not much preservation of English grammar, and a lot of the pronunciation, or a lot of the complexity of English was lost. One example of this was the loss of genders for nouns. English pronunciation also changed drastically over this time. Because English was not written down, many dialects of English developed. These dialects were incredibly different from one another, and one dialect could often not understand the other dialects. But this did not affect English much in the long run, since once English started to be written down, dialects became more unified again. One reason that English prevailed was the fact that the common class, who spoke English, were still the majority of the citizens. The citizens were not concerned that their leaders, the minority of the population, did not speak the same language as them, as this was common. When English came back as the language of England, as it started to do around 1300 or 1300, it included many French words, about 10,000 words. One reason for this was because French included many words the English did not have, because they were used solely by the upper class, such as words like Attorney General. French words also added complexity to the English language. Another reason that English regained popularity was that a law was passed that prevented the French nobles from living in both France and English. So many of the French officials moved solely to England and began to think of themselves as English instead of French, and started to develop a certain amount of English patriotism. The people in France would make fun of the way that English sounded, but the French nobles would defend the language. Kings of England as well started to try to relearn English, and by 1399, King Henry IV was a throned native English speaker. As English regained popularity, French lost favor. The 100-Year War with France made French an unpopular language throughout England. In 1362, English was declared the official language, and in 1385, English was the official language taught in schools.
Sometimes it is hard to see how a group of people can make such a huge impact. Without the Norman French, the English language would be very different. English would not have as much of French influence, and Anglo-Saxon words would have a more positive connotation. Also, English would always have been the official language of England, keeping grammatical complexity. So you should thank the Normans for your A in English class.